All right, so the first step before we start building any app pages or anything like that is defining the database. And that's really important because the database is really the scaffolding from which the rest of the application hangs. One way of thinking about what you're doing when you're configuring a database is thinking about your app as the stage. You know, a show is going to take place on the stage, and your users are the actors, but the objects that you define in the database are the props that those users are going to use. So really, everything that appears on the stage, everything that appears in the application has to be defined, has to be created by you, the app creator or the app builder. So if we just look at what Stack Exchange has, we can see that there are, a list of questions here, and it seems as though, each question has a number of different properties. We've got some votes, we've got some answers. If I click into this, then we can see the answers, right? Here's an answer. And the question is also asked by a user. So, every single application is going to have a user data type in it, all right? This comes default in Bubble, as you know. But now the question is, well, if a user can ask questions, right, should we just have, a field on this user, a field called questions, which is simply a list of texts, right? Well, the way to think about when you create an entirely separate object, a separate thing, is asking yourself, well, is there any information about this question that can't be captured in a single field? Or rather, does a question, to use this example, have more than one property, right? And clearly, if we look at the Stack Exchange example, it has this title up here, it seems, and then this extra text down here, which is the body, okay? Now, we could have, all right, we'll make this question titles, okay, and have down here question bodies, right? And they're both lists of texts. You can probably see how this is going to become a problem because a question title and a question body belong to the same question, but there's really no way to connect these two things. How to cook onion. And then, here's some, here's the body, right? These are two separate text fields. They belong to one another, but there's really nothing, right? There's nothing inherent in this text field that knows that we can connect this question title with this question body. So it warrants that we have an entirely new object called a question, which has both a title as a text field and a body as a text field. Okay, and as you probably already know, whenever you create a new thing in Bubble, it automatically populates this created by field and populates it with the user who was logged in when that object was created. So what else do we have? We have answers, right? And we know also that this is going to have more than one property because the answer has a body as a text, but it also needs to have a relationship with a particular question. And this is really where we're getting into the second sort of sub-question that you're asking yourself. The first is, what are the objects in my database? And I'm going to use the word object and thing interchangeably here because in the wider programming world, we're talking about objects, right? You have objects in a database, but in Bubble specifically, they're called things. At any rate, our answer is going to have a question as a question field, and that's implying that there's a relationship. So the second question is, what are the relationships between the objects in my database? Okay, and there's really two ways you can go about this. If you have, let's say, a question and an answer, or rather you have multiple answers, is it better for you to have a field on the answer which points back to the question, like this, or is it better instead to have a field on the question which points to the answers, right? A list of answers on the question. When answering this question, you have to think about how long that list is going to get. Okay, for lists that have a predictably finite length, you want to go for the one-to-many link, the parent to the child connection. And that's just because for shorter lists, loading a list of answers on a question is faster than doing a search for all of the answers belonging to a particular question. But when that list can be potentially infinite, in our case, it could be, right? A question could have any number of answers. Then you want to do the many to one connection. You want to do the inverse or the reverse connection, the child to the parent, right? Just to take another example, let's say you've got owners and you've got pets, right? It's a site where owners list the pets that they have. They're probably not going to have an infinite number of pets, right? Probably the number of pets that they have is going to be in the single digits for most people. And so we can quite comfortably use the one-to-many connection. Okay, so that's why in our case, right, we don't know how many answers a question is going to have. So we'll set up a field on the answer, which is pointing back to the question. What else do we have? We have a tag. Okay, so on the question, we've got a tag. And again, we're faced with the same question. Should we have a list of texts for this tag? Or does it warrant to have a tag as an entirely separate object? And in our case, right, we actually have this ability to look for all of the questions that share the same tag. And while it would be theoretically possible for this to be a text field, and when we're doing this, when we have a page in our app that's going to be looking for all of the questions that share the same tag, we could, in theory, do a search for all of the questions where the tag text equals, in this case, Gothica. But the problem is that it has to be spelt exactly the same way. And we also can't capture any other information about that tag in the future should we want to. So when we're creating these kind of intermediary objects, right, we've got a question, we've got a tag, we've got another question. Okay, it's better for this to exist as its own data type so that we can easily find all of the questions belonging to a single tag simply by finding that tag in the database, and then we can extract all that relationship data that we want. So we'll save this tag instead as actually a tag object, right? And we'll create that tag object as a separate thing in the database, which has probably, a title as a text field. Now again, just in case it's not clear, a question is going to have a finite number of tags, and so we want to have this relationship connection, the parent to the child, rather than the reverse. The other thing that a question seems to have is, if I go back here, a number of votes, right? A user is able to upvote a particular question. Now, I'm just going to add that in as a number field for now. And we're going to revisit this because in fact, a number field is not the right way to do this in our case, but we'll come back to it in order to show you why. So let's create this database now in Bubble itself. We have our user data type because you can't have a show without actors, right? You can't have an application without users, at least not the type of application that you'll be building in Bubble. We also have a question, we have an answer, and we have a tag. I always like to create all of the objects first and then go in and edit the properties, or in Bubble's case, what we call the fields of the thing. So let's start with a question. Let's see what we have. We had a title as a text field. We have a body as a text field. We have a tag as a tag, and in fact, it's going to be a list of tags. And we have votes, which we're setting up for now as a number field, but we're going to revisit that and see why that's not the right data type. Okay, we also have an answer. An answer is going to have a body. An answer is also going to have a question, right? It's associated with a particular question. And then of course we've got the tag. So the tag has just a single field, which is the text. All right, coming back to this question of votes, right? What type of field should the votes be? I'm going to open up a page that I've already pre-populated here. Okay, I've got a group here which is loading a single question, right? I have a single question in the database, and I just have a single question in the database, right? And that's pulling through the title of that question, the body, also the number of votes, which is evaluating to a number field. And we've got this button here to vote. So the first thing is I'm just going to log in as a particular user. And if you don't know already, if you've got, if you want to be testing multiple email addresses, you can just add a plus and then some variation on your email address here. That could also be some text. And when any email is triggered to this email address, it will still go to the email address without that plus value. It'll be as though it doesn't exist, but this will still be saved in the Bubble database. So it's a very handy way for testing multiple accounts all linked to the same email address. Okay, so I'm logged in. I just want to also add a workflow here. So when that vote is clicked, then I'll make changes to the question underlying, and I will, of course, increment this question's votes by a single vote. Okay, and now I'll refresh the page. And if I click vote, there it is, it goes up. Now, the obvious question is, well, should a user be able to vote an unlimited amount of times on a question? Because that's what we've got set up now. Well, how would we restrict that? Only when the current user, yeah, I'll cut to the chase. There isn't any way for us to restrict this at the moment. That number field is just a number field. We would have to actually save the user to the question, like in a list of users, so that the question can remember what users have already voted for that question, right? But if we're creating a list of users on the question, we actually don't need this number field at all. And I'll show you why. All right, let's change this, all right, to what it should be. Instead of this being a number field of votes, okay, we're actually going to set it up as a list of users. And that means that the question can remember what users have voted for this question in the past. And instead of now having, just a list of votes. We actually count up the number of users that are in that list. All right? And when we do this workflow now, we'll remove that. We can say votes, which is now a list of users, add the current user. All right? And if we preview that, okay, here's the vote. We can click it, but we can't actually click it again. Here I'm clicking multiple times and nothing is happening because that user is already in the list. So Bubble just essentially ignores that request. We don't even need to put a condition here to restrict this happening. All right, well, you might ask yourself, well, what you said before about saving a list of children onto a question only when that list is going to be relatively small, well, how does that dovetail with what you've just said? I mean, a list of users on a question, that list could be massive, right? There could be a huge amount of votes on that question, theoretically an unlimited or an infinite amount of users saved on this question. Why wouldn't we actually save, a list of questions voted for, right, on the user itself? Well, the answer is really simple. It's that whenever we're actually loading a question on the page, we're also loading all of the data associated with that question. In other words, all of the fields associated with that question. So when this question is loaded on the page, also what's loaded on the page is that list of users. If we were then instead going to have this list of questions on the user, well, that just means that we have to do a separate search, another round of work to find the votes for that question. So in this case, we wouldn't have this field at all. It doesn't make any sense for us to do that. All right, that's a little quick setup of the database. Now let's jump into adding privacy rules so that we can protect the sensitive data of our users.